Welcome to Real Foot Forward, a West Tennessee podcast from Discovery Park of America in Union City, Tennessee. Today's episode is brought to you by Main Street Union City.
Thank you, Jennifer. Welcome to Real Foot Forward, a West Tennessee podcast where we explore the history, the people, and the culture of our home in West Tennessee. I'm your host today, Zach Willis. And Scott, before I introduce today's guests, what's something you discovered this week at Discovery Park of America?
So I want to throw my discovery is really more broad. It's really Northwest Tennessee. It's our little neck of the woods here. I was driving to work this morning and I looked over just casually looked over to the side, and there was a great big giant bald eagle sitting there eating its breakfast. And I thought, that's pretty remarkable. Not everywhere in the United States do you get to just casually see a bald eagle having its breakfast when you're on your way to work.
What was the breakfast?
It was some type of animal.
Okay.
So probably a duck.
Okay.
A lot of ducks flying around right now. So, and I actually was curious. And so we have a waterfowl exhibit here, as you and our co-guest know. And so I went over and looked up a few facts about bald eagles because I was curious. So I looked that up. It was really interesting. I think they have don't they have 300 and something eagles right now at Reelfoot Lake. So this one decided to come visit us here in Union City.
That's awesome. Well, folks, if you couldn't tell already, today we have a special episode because I get to sit in the host seat and interview someone listeners know very well, someone I work with every day, Discovery Park's president and CEO, Scott Williams, and also another familiar face, Discovery Park's senior director of exhibits, Jennifer Wilds. And I'm going to give you a little bit more on both of them. Scott has more than 25 years of experience leading major cultural institutions, museums, and global brands. Before joining Discovery Park in 2018, he was at the Newseum. Before that, he was with Elvis Presley's Enterprises. And even before that, he earned his degree in journalism from the University of Memphis. He also has served on numerous boards. In addition to his leadership, Scott is a four-time author writing on forgotten figures in American history. His newest book, Townmania, Marcus Winchester and the Making of Memphis, explores the life of early Memphis settler Marcus Winchester and the forces that shaped the birth of the city. That was a mouthful, but we also have Jennifer Wilds, who is now a two-time editor of books written by R. Scott Williams, and likely one of the most familiar faces at Discovery Park of America because she has been here since 2011. That's when she was first an intern in artifacts. So we're going to talk a lot about this book, but first, Jennifer, welcome, and Scott, welcome to your own podcast.
Thank you, Zach. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you, Zach.
Before we jump into the book and everything else, we always like to start these the same way. At the beginning, listeners have heard bits and pieces of your upbringing, Scott. But first, we'll start with Jennifer, though. Can you tell us more, Jennifer, about where you got started, what you studied at UT Martin, and just more about your time here at Discovery Park?
Sure. So like you said, I've been here since 2011. So this makes it about 14 years now I've been here. Discovery Park itself opened November 2013. So that was a little bit before actually opening up to the public. So I got to see a lot of the early day behind the scenes part of that process. But so I was a student at the University of Tennessee at Martin, in Martin, Tennessee, 20 minutes from here. And Discovery Park was still getting off the ground, this new project. And just a friend actually told me, hey, did you hear about a museum that's being built in Union City? They're looking for interns. I was a history major, and they had reached out to the history department at UT Martin for potential interns. And this friend of mine was a fellow history student major. So she had caught wind of it and just said, we were working together at the movie theater in Martin at the time. And she said, I heard about this internship, or, what do you think? Would you be interested? And I said, absolutely. I said, what is Union City? Because it was just 20 minutes from here, but it's still a small town. And I was new to the area, so I wasn't aware of it. But I did what I had to do to track down who I needed to talk to at Discovery Park to try to get my foot in the door as an intern. And it worked out perfectly because I was never quite sure what I was going to do with my degree. I was always drawn to artifacts, but didn't really know how to get into that world. And so that was always kind of my dream job of maybe one day I can work in a museum and work with the artifacts themselves, taking care of them. I grew up loving antiques, so I just loved history in general, was really drawn to the actual physical historical items that were left behind. So It just, again, perfectly turned out that the internship was working with the artifacts that were going to be used for Discovery Park's opening day exhibits. So it was just, again, dream come true, right place, right time for sure. But so I jumped in as an intern. I graduated after that particular semester and was hired on at Discovery Park to kind of continue that artifact work I was doing, and have remained here ever since. My responsibilities have grown to include the exhibits as a whole, as well as just the artifacts. But so I've been here for quite a while, and I'd say working with Scott, I guess I've always been drawn to it. They just kind of had a knack for English and grammar and that kind of thing. And I think just working with Scott over the years here at Discovery Park, he saw something in how I did exhibits or just how I edited or approved some of Discovery Park's materials that he felt comfortable enough to give me a crack at being an editor for his book.
Nice. One thing that you have that Scott and I don't have at Discovery Park was the opportunity to work with Robert Kirkland. Could you tell us more about what that was like and any unique stories you might have?
So I did get to be around him, not as much as others, because again, I was coming in as an intern. I was, more so just this college student. So I wasn't privy to as many things as you might think, compared to kind of my role now in Discovery Park. But I was able to be with him again. My focus was really with the artifacts. So whenever this was right in the bustle of them trying to acquire a lot of large-scale artifacts for the exhibit. So anytime something, big and really interesting showed up, we'd all go out there to the warehouse, whether it was cars or I remember our Gutenberg printing press when it arrived. And that's when really I got to see a lot of Mr. Kirkland and kind of be around him. He would talk with, whoever was a part of acquiring that item. And I would just kind of get to listen and hear how his brain worked and how excited he was about this item, and got to understand a little bit more about his wish to have that particular item in Discovery Park. But I would say came across to me as a very quirky and fun person. He had his own ideas for what Discovery Park needed to be, but at the forefront, he wanted it to be educating, of course, but a just really fun experience and an inspirational experience to the guests that were going to come by and visit, especially the younger generations.
Awesome. I should have also taken it all the way back to where you grew up, if you don't mind just going back even further one more time.
So I was born in Memphis, so I grew up there. My family moved outside of Memphis to Brighton, which is about 45 minutes north of Memphis, into more of a rural area. But I grew up in Memphis, and my mother's family, my father's family grew up there. So I spent a lot of time hearing about, but then also just experiencing for myself life in Memphis. But after I would call Brighton my hometown. That's where I spent most of my years. And then whenever I graduated high school, I spent some time in college in Jackson and then wound up in Martin, where I've remained to this day.
Awesome. All right. Well, now we're going to shift back over to Mr. Scott Williams. If you could tell us more about where you grew up, what your family did, and just what kind of dreams you had, Scott.
Sure. So I grew up in Memphis. Parkway Village is where my parents took me after I was born in Baptist Hospital, and we stayed in Parkway Village. Memphis folks will know where that is. It's right next to where the Mall of Memphis was built. It used to be called the New Mall for years and years, and then the mall was built out on the interstate that became the New Mall, and then the mall that used to be the New Mall was torn down, so it is no more. It is a field now, as it was when I was a kid, and I would play in that field. And I remember very specifically riding my big wheel in the ditches there in what would become the Mall of Memphis. My family and I moved, just like Jennifer, in the fourth grade. We moved to Eads, Tennessee, which at the time was kind of Collierville, Germantown, that direction. And at the time it was very rural, still pretty rural, but it's, of course, built up a lot now as, the east of Memphis grew up more. Went to Briarcrest. When I was in the eighth grade, my dad felt called into the ministry and moved our family to Fort Worth, Texas, where I went to high school while he went to Southwestern Seminary. and then ended up going to the University of Memphis, went back home to Memphis and majored in journalism with a concentration in advertising. Worked in a lot of different communications, advertising, marketing related fields and jobs and ad agencies and things like that, and then landed at Elvis Presley Enterprises, which was absolutely life changing. Got to take care of business for the King for 12 years, from 2000 to 2012. It was a great place to learn all about the entertainment business, the tourism business, the communications business, online. That was all new. So anyway, then I moved to Washington, D.C. to work at the Newseum, which was an amazing place. Worked there 7 years, and then came back to Tennessee. I never really got over being a Tennessee resident. Love Tennessee. Tennessee's my home. 7, 8 generations back from my ancestry. So I was really excited to get to come back and work at Discovery Park of America with Jennifer.
Awesome. I have somewhat of a connection to the Newseum with you in a way. I used to work for a place called Kentucky Publishing in Paducah. They also had a small newspaper called the Northwest Tennessee Volunteer.
Okay.
But in that role, I was given access to newseumed.org, and I would be told to go get inspiration there, front pages and today's front pages. And for that Tennessee paper, I remember when I think it was sometime in 2018, Scott Williams was named the new CEO of Discovery Park of America. I was laying out the paper, put your big face on the cover of the paper, read the article myself, saw that you came from the Newseum. I was like, oh, wow, I check that stuff out all the time. So this guy must be a big deal. Thought that was pretty cool.
That is cool. That's very interesting. The front pages that you mentioned was really a fascinating thing that they did at the Newseum. They would have the front pages from 50 different newspapers all along the front of the building. So as people were walking to and from the Capitol or the White House or whatever, they would be able to stop and walk along and compare how did the different towns and cities, how did they cover the particular news of the previous day. So it would be very interesting to see who used what photo, how they cropped it, what headlines they chose. It was a really interesting setup, and people would come in at 4 a.m., start printing those out, and then by 5 a.m. they were out there putting them in the little holders. And I was just looking to see, I think, yes, my friends are still doing that. So my friends over at the Newseum, it's the Freedom Forum now. So you can go to freedomforum.org and check out the front pages from all over the country, which is so fascinating.
Awesome. So those are two pretty impressive things on your resume. You don't really care about putting out a resume anymore, but those jobs you had, what did you learn in either one of those with Elvis Enterprises or with the Newseum that you have brought to you at Discovery Park of America?
I've been so blessed to be able to, have some really cool places to get to spend my days. And at all of them, it really comes down to the people that are there. Getting to spend time, when you work a place and you do, some big initiatives like we all do here at the Newseum. I'm sorry, like we all do here at Discovery Park. And today we're putting together the Let It Glow event, and it really does take a huge group of people putting things on. The nice thing about what we do at all three places, at Graceland, at the Newseum, and here at Discovery Park, we put on events, and we put on press conferences, and we put on lighting ceremonies, and we put on programs, and when you do that, you really learn team building. And so we have the benefit, we don't have to necessarily go to a team building place outside of here, because we do it every single day when we try to open an exhibit or, things like that. So all three places, I really learned about the value of a team that works together well enough to where we can honestly know we know what each other's thinking. We are like, you're a sci-fi person. What is that on the Borg? We're like the Borg in a lot of ways, we're like one entity. And so I think that's really important, that you listen to what everybody has to say. at both at Graceland, Jack Soden, was a superstar leader who, I learned so much from. And at the Newseum, Jan Newharth, who was Al Newharth's daughter, she is still the board chair, and Jack is still the president at Graceland. And both of them were amazing leaders that I learned a lot from by working at their side and watching how they dealt with challenges and solving problems and things like that. So I do feel like I've brought things from all the places that I've been able to work at.
And so, besides that, as R. Scott Williams, you are a writer, and on your fourth book now. But take me back to when you decided that you wanted to be a writer, and when exactly you put out your first book.
So I've always enjoyed writing, just in college and, just writing. I was always a person who wrote journals, and, I find them now and they're embarrassing. So I try to decide if I should burn them or not. But, I wrote some very heartfelt, angst-filled journals, as a young adult. So I've enjoyed writing. Of course, I majored in journalism, and you had to write, and typically ad copy and things like that. But then when the internet started coming out, I stumbled upon genealogy, set up an ancestry.com account and started researching my own genealogy and discovered some fascinating, aspects to my own family history. I had always been interested in history. I used to interview my grandparents, which I'm really glad I did now. Probably a lot of people don't do that, but, I had one of those great big giant cameras. And even before that, I had a little tape recorder. All those recordings are lost now, but I had a little tape recorder. And as a little kid, I would interview my grandparents about the past and ask questions about their childhood. And then as I got older and I had a camera, I would video, and sometimes I would even, video with them without their knowledge, and, get a lot of information about the past. Anyway, so, I just started doing a blog because I wanted to use the newfound World Wide Web. And so I set up, my Ancestry account and learned, and then I would blog about what I learned on Blogger, is what it was called for old timers. They might remember Blogger. And then, so I wrote one blog entry about Richard Halliburton and got an email out of nowhere from the History Press. And they said, "We read your blog and your post about Richard Halliburton. Have you thought about writing a book about him?" And I hadn't, of course. And they said, "We'll kind of guide you through it." And so I thought, well, this is an opportunity. I shouldn't not take advantage of it. So I did, and learned about how you write a book and wrote the book about Richard Halliburton. I would love to go back and revisit it again now that I've learned a lot in 15 years, but I'm going to do that. I'm only going to go forward. But anyway, so then published a few more and then started self-publishing the things that I'm interested in. I talked to some agents and they said, you need to only publish books about people that people already know about, and I was like, well, why write about something people already know about? I'd rather write about people that no one's ever heard of. And so, my goal is not really to make money. My goal is to, let people know about interesting things about people that they might not know about. And so started doing it myself, but it's really important that you have a really good editor when you do this. And if you're self-publishing, you don't have that. So you hire a really good editor. And so, I talked to some folks and looked at some editors, and it dawned on me I have the best editor in the world that I work with and am friends with here. So I pitched to Jennifer, the possibility of me paying her to be the editor of the David Crockett book, and she graciously agreed to. And you can find out from her what that process was like. But and so she did such a phenomenal job on that one that she also hired her to do the Marcus Winchester book as well. And we have, when it comes to, I know I'm doing that thing that guests do where they just talk nonstop. So that's good for you, right? So when she and I typically I like to proof things, as you very well know. But when I first got here, Jennifer, I was like, hey, I'd like to proof this before it's done. And so she just forgot to show it to me until it was up on the wall. And I mean, I'm telling you, we've worked together now for 8 years, 7 years, going on 8. I've never seen one error in a didactic panel of an exhibit. I mean, she does not make a mistake. Uh-oh, I better knock on wood for your sake, Jennifer. Sorry about that. I'm jinxing you.
This brings up a question again for Jennifer then. For when you are editing these books for Scott, are you able to enjoy the story, or are you just all in on the grammar and editing process?
So that's a good question. So with Scott's book about David Crockett, his earlier book, so that was my first ever attempt at actually editing on a book. It was a learning process for me, but I went into it thinking, oh, it's just like how I edit anything else. I'm sure I'll just go through, and basically I'm just looking at the words, looking at the grammar. But then I kept finding myself with the Crockett book. Suddenly 3 chapters had gone by and I realized I wasn't editing a thing. I was just reading the story. So I kept, that's what I struggled with his first book, is that I just kept getting drawn to the story itself, that I would completely forget what my purpose was in the first place, that I was supposed to be focusing on. So with Marcus Winchester, I said, okay, Scott's writing, I know it's going to pull me in again. He did that with the last one. So I decided to do it a little differently this time, and I wanted to just read the book as just a normal reader. I wanted to enjoy the story, but I knew that would help me, hopefully, when I came to the editing process, not be as distracted by the story again. So I did that. I was able to truly enjoy and learn about this book, and then I went back through after that, and I have kind of an annoyingly way too intense, probably, attention to detail. So Scott, poor Scott, but
no, it's not too intense. Absolutely not. Because there's so many things that, like, she would make notes or find things, and I'll be like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad she found that. Because it's hard to get to not miss anything.
Especially when you're the one who has written the words, you know what you were trying to say, or you know what it's meant to be. So your brain kind of just reads it as that sometimes. So, the point of having an editor, it's someone who didn't write those words. So certain things just stick out, to me more than it would have Scott. But no, that's kind of how I approached editing this book. And I think it was the way to go.
Awesome. Well, we're going to dive into this new book on Marcus Winchester a bit more here, but first we're going to take a quick break.
Looking for something fun to do while in Union City? Our downtown district has a variety of chic boutiques, tasty bites, and more for the whole family to enjoy. You can find hours of operation for all the places to eat, shop, and play at mainstreetunioncity.com/things to do.
I hope you're enjoying the Real Foot Forward podcast from Discovery Park of America. If you are, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and leave a positive review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Our guests today are Scott Williams and Jennifer Wilds. So Scott, you are now a 4-time author, and your newest book, Townmania, Marcus Winchester and the Making of Memphis, is coming out at the perfect time with several big Tennessee milestones on the horizon. We're going to dive in. After reading more about the man, the answer feels obvious, but after writing a book about a notable name like David Crockett, what drew you most to Marcus Winchester for your next book?
Typically, when I'm like researching, for me, when I just read a book, like, it's hard for me to read a book because the whole time, whenever they introduce a character, I read mostly historical nonfiction biographies and things like that. And so when I'm reading a book, I am 100% distracted by trying to research what happened to that person later, or where did they come from, even though the writer will tell me a lot about it. So I just love to find out more. I have a big curiosity when it comes to history. And so when I'm writing a book, like with Odd McIntyre or with David Crockett, I will run across a person's name or a character in their life, and it will make me wonder more about that person. So with David Crockett, when I was researching for that for that biography. There was a moment in his life where he was going to try to make money by cutting down some of the cypress trees on the Omayan River, and then take those down to New Orleans to sell to make money to fund his congressional campaign. And he crashed right outside of Memphis. A steamboat took him to Memphis, and essentially he said, "Take me to your leader." And they took him to Marcus Winchester, and he wrote a bit about Marcus Winchester. And as it turned out, secretly, Marcus Winchester, who was in the Andrew Jackson, John Overton camp to some degree, he funded David Crockett's campaign secretly because David Crockett and Andrew Jackson were enemies, but Marcus Winchester leaned more towards the ideals that David Crockett represented than John Overton. So I thought it was really interesting, and I just Googled him and started looking up more about him. And there were just so many different aspects to him as a settler in Memphis. And it seemed like a lot of what people said about him didn't seem to be true to me. And so the more I looked it up, the more I thought, hey, there's a really interesting story here about race and culture and, early history of Memphis, which is a city I love. And so it just Marcus Winchester. The more I researched, I thought, okay, yeah, there is a book here, and that was 3 years ago. And then, so I spent a lot of hours now at the Tennessee Library and Archives in Nashville, and in the history room on the fourth floor at the Memphis main library. So, the more you research and read, and the more you get to know these people, the more you feel like they're someone whose story you want the world to know about, warts and all.
So where did the title Townmania come from?
Yeah, so actually, I have that as a quote. I'm turning around and grabbing the book. And it's a quote in how you put a little quote in the front of a book. So this came from a letter that Marcus Winchester's father, James Winchester, wrote to John Overton. So James Winchester, John Overton, and Andrew Jackson were all in business together. They had invested in the John Rice track on the Fourth Chickasaw Bluff, which would eventually become Memphis. And they were hustling. They were really wanting to make a lot of money off this deal, and so they bought it for a very low price, and then they divided it up between themselves, the ownership. And then Andrew Jackson, and Marcus Winchester was there with him. He negotiated the Treaty of 1818 with the Chickasaw, and which could today be seen as a bit of a conflict of interest because he benefited financially. But they're hustling, they're trying to make money. And James Winchester wrote a letter on November 22nd, 1818 to John Overton that said, "I am satisfied the effects of Townmania will not last always, and perhaps not long." So he was, there was a real hustle to try to get land and to try to sell. Everybody was wanting to move west. And so, he was an opportunist, and so as soon as I read that on a letter, on the, at the State Library and Archives, I was like, I wrote that down in big letters. That is the name of the book. So, because it's kind of unusual. Of course, I also had to look up real quick and see if anybody else had written a book called Townmania. Fortunately, they had not.
Nice. That is a cool name. And you're just holding the book there. So it makes me also wonder what inspired the cover design.
So I really didn't want, and I talked to, all my covers have been designed by one of my closest friends, Tom Martin, who's an award-winning, incredibly talented graphic designer in Memphis. And he and I met when we both worked together at Clio Gift Wrap at least 30 years ago. And so he does all my covers for me. And we wanted Marcus Winchester, but we wanted him younger than all of the current pictures. So he worked on that. And then it's the stone there, or the cobblestone streets of Memphis. Even though Marcus Winchester was long gone when the cobblestones started not long gone, maybe, 10, 15 years gone. But, the cobblestones are an iconic part of Memphis that everybody knows, including Jennifer. I'm sure when she was a little girl like me, she probably went down to the river and stood on those cobblestones.
Well, so speaking of that with Jennifer, you're from the Memphis area too. Is there a character or story you were drawn to as you were editing this book?
Well, first off, in general, I just wanted to say I was more connected with this book. I really enjoyed Scott's David Crockett book, but I'm a history person. That's what I'm interested in. That's what I studied. That's what my job revolves around. So of course I was drawn to the historical aspects of both the David Crockett book and Marcus Winchester now. But with this one, being from Memphis, I just felt more of a tie to it, to the story, because even though my family, as far as my father and mother, we moved away in the third grade, but my grandparents still remained there. So even though we no longer lived in Memphis, I still often came to the area, stayed with them, for the weekends. Would often go down to, they kind of lived more so in the, I guess it would be Midtown, kind of close to the zoo area. But we would go down to the downtown a lot in those areas. With Midtown, we're very close to Overton Park. So I was drawn to seeing names that I was familiar with, as far as what landmarks and streets, parks were named, and then getting to actually learn about the history of how those came to be, about the people that they were named after. I was just really drawn to the story in that way. So I think that a lot of other folks who are familiar with Memphis will feel the same. Scott was wonderful at, even though he's talking in this historic time period, he would provide present day descriptors of the location, so that you could, if again you are from the area and the region, and you know what some of this might be, you could kind of better picture the story. He would say where the location of the current day, the Bass Pro Shops Pyramid, or Le Bonheur, and you can kind of go, okay, I know where that is. And it's funny, actually, not long after reading his book, I found myself in downtown Memphis, just as a passenger. But to myself, in my head, I was looking around going, and I was looking at the road streets. I said, okay, I remember this part, of Scott's book, and what he said was in this area. Oh, there's that one thing that he mentioned. Okay, yeah, I can still see remnants of that left behind. So I enjoyed going back to Memphis after reading his book and kind of trying to find some of these stories that he had described, and really be able to kind of picture it and put myself back in that time period. And as far as, sorry to go back to your question about characters or stories that jumped out at me, other than just Memphis in general, in which Scott touched on this about what drew him to Marcus Winchester. He's fantastic about introducing these plethora of unique characters that are related to the story but are not the true main character, and doing so in a way that it intrigues you and makes you interested in that person. He doesn't. It's not necessarily a true deep dive of this person, but it's enough information that you really kind of, again, it gives you that interest of, well, maybe I can look that up later, or maybe I want to learn more about that person. And it's funny that in his David Crockett book, Marcus Winchester was that person to me as well. He jumped out at me, and I went, that's a unique person. That's a unique character. I wouldn't mind reading a book about him. So luckily that was Scott's next direction. But in this book, I was kind of more drawn to Emerante Loisel, who was his first wife. And to say all of that about, Scott kind of giving you enough information, that you understand the character enough, but that it leaves you kind of wanting more. In her case, though, there was very little information about her. And I think it's fair to say, Scott, that any possible scrap that existed about her, you found it, and it's in the book.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I hope that I didn't. I hope somebody out there has more somewhere. But I did as much as I possibly could in the time frame that I had to find more. But I really think she was intentionally hidden away from public because of the fact that she was a biracial, mixed race, whatever you want to say. She was from St. Louis, and she was not white. And so Marcus Winchester married her. They had 8 children together. At the time he married her, it wasn't as big of a deal as it would one day become. as the country polarized over the issue of slavery, people who were of mixed race became a threat to those who were in favor of maintaining slavery as it was. And so they became the enemy in many ways, to the point where here Marcus Winchester had devoted his life to developing. He was the first mayor, he opened the first ferry, he opened the first stores, the first banks. I mean, he was the first business person. He was a one-man chamber of commerce, as I like to say, and advocated for the growth of the city, unlike anyone else at all. And yet the city council passed a law that said no white man could, in quotation marks, keep a colored wife. And so him and Amarante and their children had to move outside the city limits of Memphis. So it was fascinating. I've always wondered, because my ancestors settled in Haywood County in early 1830s, around 1832. And so I always was fascinated by not just what their names and birth dates and death dates were, but, what did they live like? What did they think? What were they exposed to? And so through this, it was interesting to see how slavery impacted people who weren't slave owners, and, people who were not white but free, like Amarante. So yeah, I think my eyes were opened by a lot of the things that they had to think about that I never realized. So I agree. She is a fascinating character. And I do, to your point, I hope that we can figure out, there's people who've written about them in the past who said, according to the records that we have found, they married on this date at this, but I can't find the records. So, I try to only, say these are the facts. And if I don't know, or if it's just supposed, then I'll say, some think, because I really want the facts. And so, in a nutshell, it appears as though the story that happened in actuality was very different than the story that was told in the early, years of last century. So, anyway, I agree with you. She was a fascinating character.
Yeah, for me, I was drawn to her fortitude as far as being, the partner to this prominent figure, as you just mentioned, all of the things he accomplished and was a part of in the city of Memphis, but yet to still stick by him and endure, the negativity that was thrown her way just because she was mixed race. I was really drawn to that, and I appreciated that with what little you had, you were able to bring her story to light in some way.
Well, and honestly, a lot of that goes to all the other people that have come before who've really researched. And I did try to do that too in the book. I'm fascinated by the people that are passionate about recording history as it was, as realistic as they can for those of us that come later. And you and I, Jennifer, have put this down in a book for the people who come after us, who can hopefully find more, using tools that maybe, haven't even been invented yet. So hopefully someday more about their life will be able to be uncovered. I wish there was just like a big giant trunk of letters somewhere, but none of the letters I could find from the family, the Overton, the Winchester, they all had money. And so they could afford to, write letters back and forth. And, there's hundreds and hundreds of letters written by Marcus Winchester. They're very difficult to decipher, but I deciphered as many as I could. And I couldn't find any reference to Amarante, and so in the particular letters that have survived. So when John Overton was about to die, he was best buds with Andrew Jackson, and they had been buddies since all the way back when they were young men before they had married and become successful. But when he died, he had all of the letters that he and Andrew Jackson had exchanged that he had them burned and destroyed. So I think that was kind of the thing back then, is if you didn't want people, reading your letters, you burned them up. And so I suspect all of the letters that referenced Amarante or that talked about her were at some point destroyed, but maybe not. Maybe someone will find some.
If I can jump in one more time, Zach, I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead. Go ahead.
You made me think, Scott. It was another story towards the end of your book that really hit me hard. Just again, being a history person and specifically someone who's really drawn to the physical items that are left behind, as you mentioned, working with. But then the story that I was drawn to are the items that are no longer around anymore. Specifically, what happened over the years to the Winchester Cemetery, and you may be able to explain that story a little better than I.
Well, I mean, it's tragic, for us today. They didn't think about it that way back then, back in, 1830, 1840. People died a lot. People died young. And when you died, they buried you in the ground as quickly as possible, and they had to move on with life. And so the first cemetery was right in town, and people were not liking that. And so Marcus Winchester donated the land, called it the Winchester Cemetery in honor of his father who had just died, and people began to be buried there. So all of the, founding fathers and mothers and children of Memphis were buried there. But it was, it was not maintained to the degree that we would eventually, as a society, learn, after the Civil War. Death became a different kind of thing, and people wanted to turn, the cemeteries into parks where you could go visit your loved ones at their grave. And so anyway, back then it just wasn't cared for as much. And so, through the years, some horrible, they did horrible things and that were recorded in the newspapers. And, the Tennessee, forget what they call the old folks of Tennessee, the old folks of Memphis. Anyway, they tried to manage the cemetery. Multiple groups and organizations tried to manage the cemetery. But at one point, they decided to cut a road from one side to the other. And so they dug right through the cemetery to create the road. And they didn't really care about the fact of what they were doing. And as they did it, they were opening up graves. Coffins were laying everywhere. Bones, the clothing of the people, the things they had been buried with was all just laying around. And so, the people were like, uh-oh, look what we did. And so they just pulled all that stuff up and buried it in one big ditch in the middle of the cemetery. Eventually, they decided to make a park out of it. One of the mayors actually had the remaining headstones pulled into the middle of the cemetery, and the headstones were ground to dust that was spread around. So, and as much as that all seems like it took place in the far, far past, it was I talk about it in the book, only, last year, St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, which is an amazing place in Memphis, doing incredible work. They were building a parking garage and accidentally ran across some of the bodies that had been buried in Winchester Cemetery, and they're reinterring the bodies at Elmwood Cemetery, which is a beautiful cemetery in Memphis. If anybody ever is looking for fun things to do in Memphis architecturally and historically, and an exploring Elmwood Cemetery, will take you a whole day, and it's an incredible place. So the bodies that they have dug up will be reinterred there and paid tribute there. But still, in the back of the book, I do list the names of the people who were buried there that I could find. So at least they're captured there, but they're not captured anywhere else. I think there should be sort of a memorial to them somewhere. But as a history lover myself, you're right. It's tragic that we've lost all of that information.
Okay. I'm still here, guys. Just kidding.
I know, right? Sorry
but
about that.
It's okay. No,
we're bad guests.
No, you're a great guest.
Thank you.
We're on some touchy subjects. I feel like we typically keep these podcasts lighthearted, but like this stuff is bringing up a question I wanted to ask. Your portrayal of early European explorers and the treatment of Native Americans and enslaved people, it's pretty blunt. Some readers may be surprised by the murder, disease, and cruelty you describe. Do you see this as part of today's broader conversation about how we tell American history?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we need to try to report it as accurately as we can. Of course, you always, just like Robert Kirkland, when he wanted to create Discovery Park of America, he wanted it to be, our didactic panels tell the truth, our exhibits, we tell the truth, we tell the facts, but also it's a fun and interesting place. And so, I think it's important to tell both the good, the bad, and the ugly, because it happened. And how else will we learn? How else will we know about what's going to happen in the future. You can look at the past and take away a lot of knowledge from it of what may happen in the future. Working in the different places I've worked, I know that if you do A, very likely B will happen. But if you do C and D together, F will happen. And so same way with history. We can look back and see, here's what has happened, and you can absolutely explore the atrocities, the tragedies, the mistreatment of an entire group of people. You can talk about, examine, explore the impact of slavery on American society then and since then. To try and talk about history without that would be foolish.
Right on. Okay. So now I want to switch gears to something cooler or good stuff. I haven't read the book yet, but I know some things about it. And one of my favorite things about it is that you titled each chapter after a song. How do those titles enhance the story and the story about Memphis and Marcus Winchester?
Sure. So, of course, you think about Memphis, you think about the music, Memphis's history and connection to all the genres of music goes all the way back to the very beginning of the city. And so all of the titles, and it was kind of fun to try and find the ones that would represent, but all the titles are song titles that either were written by a Memphis writer or were sung by a Memphis singer or were about the city itself. And there are really hundreds and hundreds of books written about Memphis. I'm sorry, hundreds of songs written about Memphis. And so it was fun trying to make it make sense, put the music title, but then also, make sure that it aligns with what's happening in the chapter. Yeah, that was fun. And then in the end of the book, I sort of tell just briefly the history of that particular song. And I do wonder if some people, because I don't make a point until the end, to put in the appendix, the song title. So hopefully people won't even realize until they're halfway through, wait a minute, I think these are all song titles.
If they listen to Real Foot Forward, they'll know.
That's true. That's true. They'll know.
Okay, so I know you also wanted to get this out before 2026. Can you tell us more about the significance of that year in this book?
Yeah, I mean, of course, when you're doing something like a book, you want to put it out when people will be at home for Thanksgiving, and they'll be on their laptops and their phones sitting around the fire watching football games. And so, I'll have a Facebook ad campaign and, some other ways that people will be exposed to the existence of the book. So hopefully they'll either download it, because it'll be in paperback, hardback, and ebook. So hopefully they'll download it and read it, during the holidays. And then also it makes a great Christmas present. So for people who don't know what to buy, the history loving person in their family, I think, and I tried to make it be so it will be interesting to people, no matter where you're from, whether you're from Memphis or somewhere else in Tennessee or somewhere else in the United States. And then, of course, next year, as we all know, because we're working on it for Discovery Park of America, there are multiple anniversaries, but the biggest one is America 250. So we're celebrating the 250th birthday of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and that's a big anniversary. It also just so happens to be the 230th. It's Marcus Winchester's 230th birthday. But back in the Elvis world, rather than say it was, Elvis's 75th birthday, which makes him sound really old, we would say the anniversary of his birth, which is a lot better. So, although, Marcus Winchester would have been 230 years old, but that's just like the state of Tennessee. Tennessee is also 230 years old because Marcus Winchester was born a month before the state of Tennessee was born. Also, it is the bicentennial of Memphis being incorporated on December 19th, 200 years previously. So a lot of really cool anniversaries, a lot of reasons to celebrate history. I think there will be a real hopefully a resurgence in people being interested in history after this next year and an appreciation for history. I know people like Jennifer and myself, we have both loved history since we were young, and hopefully this will also introduce a whole generation to the how fascinating it can be to study the details of the things that have happened before and the personalities and the people. That's what I like the most, is looking at the people and the interesting things they did. You know, you can never really know 100%, but that's why I like the letters. I like seeing what they wrote and what they scratched out and things like that. So hopefully all of these things will create an interest, you know, in people wanting to find out more about Memphis and how it was born.
Well, I only have a couple more questions for you, but the first one here is anything else you want to say about the book, and where can our listeners find and order your book?
And let me say also, Zach, you're doing a phenomenal job of being the host. So you do realize that means that, you know, a lot of times when I can't come in, you tag, you're it. So if people want to know, of course, you can search on Amazon. You can search Townmania, R. Scott Williams, and it'll come up. I also have a website for my books, rscottwilliams.info, where people can see all four of the books and where they can find the links to the other ones. And then there will be select bookstores where you can find the book. I know for sure we'll have it here at Discovery Park of America. And then it'll be autographed. And then it'll be in some other bookstores in Memphis, but I'm just getting started working on that, so I don't know which ones yet.
Okay. Well, we will link all that in the show notes as well for you, Scott.
Thank you.
Last question for you. Who is the next iconic name in history that R. Scott Williams is going to write about?
You know, Jennifer and I were talking about my next book, and I'm not sure that I'm going to write about it yet, so I'm not going to say. But during the Thanksgiving holidays, I'm going to read every book I can get on this subject and see if I feel like there is an opportunity to provide more information on the subject that would be worthy of spending time researching and writing. It is a fascinating subject, I will tell you that much.
Okay. Looking forward.
Jennifer, do you agree? Do you agree it's a fascinating subject?
I agree, and very local to us.
That's right. There's a clue for you.
Uh-oh. Can't wait to find out. Well, hey, thank you both for joining us on Real Foot Forward today.
Thank you, Zach. It's been a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you for inviting me along.
And thanks to all you listeners who have joined us today at Discovery Park America. Shout out to our friends over at Main Street Union City for sponsoring today's episode. Our mission here is to inspire children and adults to see beyond. To plan an experience here for you and your family, visit discoveryparkofamerica.com.